It is April 1476. A young painter in Florence, just 24 years old and already considered one of the city's greatest talents, is accused of a crime. The punishment carries death. Within hours, he was in custody, with his future in the hands of a court he cannot control. The charges are eventually dropped. No witness comes forward. He walks out of that courtroom a free man. But he never speaks about it, not once, not to anyone. And for the next 43 years, he keeps almost everything about his private life hidden from the world. The man who would paint the most famous image in history was hiding something. And this is where his story truly begins. On the 15th of April, 1452, near a small hilltop town called Vinci, in the Tuscany region of what is now Italy, a boy was born. His name was Leonardo, and from his very first breath, his life was built on contradiction. His father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a respected and successful notary. The Da Vinci family had produced notaries for generations, men who drew up legal documents, handled contracts, and served the wealthy families of Florence. It was a position of standing and comfort. His mother, Caterina, was a young peasant woman, poor, unmarried, and in 15th century Florence, the gap between a notary and a peasant woman was not just social, it was legal. It was permanent. Leonardo was born outside of marriage, what people of that era called illegitimate, and that single fact, the accident of which bed he was born from, closed more doors than most people could count. He could not become a notary like his father and the generations before him. That profession required legitimate birth and formal Latin education. He would not receive that education, could not inherit property the way his legitimate half-brothers would, because his father went on to marry 4 times and father 11 more children, all of them with more legal standing than Leonardo. By the rules of his world, he was supposed to amount to very little. His early years were spent mostly in Vinci itself, in the household of his paternal grandfather, Antonio da Vinci. Tax records from 1457 confirm he was living there by the time he was 5. What the records do not show is what the countryside was doing to him. He was absorbing it. Young Leonardo watched how water moved around rocks, the patterns it made, the way it spiraled. He studied the wings of birds in flight, the way they angled and tilted with the wind. He drew everything: rocks, plants, animals, the shapes of clouds, the way light fell through leaves. Even with no formal teacher telling him to do this, he simply could not stop. His uncle, Francesco, who also lived in Vinci and never pursued the busy professional life of the city, took a particular interest in the boy. Some historians believe Francesco was an important early influence, a gentle, curious man who encouraged Leonardo to look at the world rather than simply pass through it. And then there was his father's library. Though Leonardo never received the formal Latin education of scholars, the books and manuscripts that passed through his father's hands gave him access to a world of ideas. He was always watching, reading and drawing, and somewhere around his 14th or 15th year, his father made a decision that would redirect the entire course of human history. He gathered some of his son's sketches and walked them to Florence. Florence in the 1460s was unlike anywhere else on earth. The Medici family controlled the city, and they had turned it into the intellectual and artistic capital of the known world. They funded painters, sculptors, poets, and philosophers. They commissioned buildings that would still be standing 600 years later. They created an atmosphere where a man with talent and ideas could rise, regardless of where he had been born. Ser Piero da Vinci brought his son's drawings to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most celebrated artists in all of Florence. Verrocchio worked across everything: painting, sculpture, goldsmithing, metalwork, engineering, theatrical design. His workshop was not just an art studio, it was a laboratory of ideas. Verrocchio looked at the boy's drawings, and he said yes. Leonardo arrived as an apprentice, most likely around 1466, at the age of 14. Over the next 6 years, he learned things that would form the backbone of everything he would ever do. He learned to prepare and mix paints, to grind pigment from minerals and earths, to stretch and prime a canvas, to work stone and metal, how to cast bronze, think in 3 dimensions, calculate the geometry of perspective, how lines converge and spaces recede to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. He worked alongside other apprentices who would themselves become legends. Sandro Botticelli was there. So was Pietro Perugino, who would later teach Raphael. These were not ordinary surroundings. This was the most concentrated gathering of artistic talent in the world, all inside one busy, chaotic, glorious workshop. And Leonardo, even among this company, stood apart. There is a painting from this period that tells the whole story without words. It is called The Baptism of Christ, and Verrocchio painted most of it. But he handed one section to his young apprentice. The angel in the lower left corner. Leonardo painted it. Giorgio Vasari, the 16th century art historian who wrote one of the earliest accounts of Leonardo's life, tells us that when Verrocchio saw what the boy had done, he was so struck by the quality of it, so moved by how far it surpassed his own hand, that he resolved never to paint again. Whether that is perfectly accurate or slightly embellished by Vasari's admiration, we cannot say with complete certainty. But look at the painting. The difference is still there today. Verrocchio's figures are competent and skilled. Leonardo's angel is something else entirely, softer, more human, more alive. The boy was barely 20 years old. By 1472, at just 20 years of age, Leonardo had qualified as a master in the Guild of St. Luke, the guild of artists and doctors in Florence. He was now officially a professional. His father even helped him set up his own studio. But Leonardo's world was about to shake. In April of 1476, an anonymous accusation was dropped into a wooden box outside the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence. The box was called the Tamburo, and it existed specifically for citizens to report crimes they did not want their names attached to. The accusation named Leonardo and 3 other young men. The charge was sodomy, which in the context of that time and place meant homosexual conduct. The specific accusation involved a 17-year-old apprentice named Jacopo Saltarelli. In Florence in the 1470s, this was a potentially capital offense. The city even had a special police unit called the Officers of the Night, established specifically to pursue and punish such behavior. Leonardo was taken before the authorities. He was held for a period of hours. His legal status hung in the air for roughly 2 months. Then the charges were dropped. No witness came forward to testify. The accusation had been anonymous, and without someone willing to stand behind it, the case dissolved. Leonardo was acquitted, but the mark it left did not dissolve as easily. After 1476, Leonardo's personal life went essentially dark. He became more guarded, more private, more sealed off from the world. He never married. He left behind no documented romantic relationships with women. He kept his inner life behind a wall that historians have been trying to climb ever since. Some of the most respected scholars of his life, including Walter Isaacson, whose 2017 biography is among the most thorough ever written, have argued that Leonardo was almost certainly homosexual. The 1476 charges, his lifelong solitude, the deep attachments he formed with male companions, and certain qualities of sensuality in his paintings of young male figures all point in the same direction. Others are more cautious, noting that direct evidence is thin, that the 1476 charges may have been politically motivated to embarrass people connected to the Medici rather than truly aimed at Leonardo, and that absence of female relationships is not proof of much. What we know for certain is this: Leonardo was a man who lived with extraordinary privacy around his personal life. Whatever he felt, whatever he desired, he kept it close. And the events of 1476 likely had something to do with why. By 1481, Leonardo was nearly 30 years old. He had established himself in Florence, received commissions, and was highly respected. But he was not satisfied. He had been given a major commission by the Augustinian monks of San Donato, a Scoppetto in Florence, a large and complex painting called the Adoration of the Magi. It was meant to show the three wise men from the biblical story arriving to pay tribute to the infant Jesus. Leonardo had begun the work. He had covered the panel with an extraordinary underdrawing, full of movement and emotion and architectural complexity, figures swirling around a central scene of the Virgin and Child. And then he simply left Florence, leaving it unfinished. The monks eventually gave the commission to another painter, Filippino Lippi, who completed a version of the same subject in 1496. Leonardo's abandoned panel remained as he left it. It sits today in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, technically incomplete, and still one of the most studied preparatory works in all of Renaissance art. Why did he leave? Because he had decided Florence was not big enough for what he had in mind. And he had written a letter. The letter was addressed to Ludovico Sforza, the powerful ruler of Milan. Ludovico, known as Il Moro, meaning the Moor, was one of the most ambitious men in Italy. He had taken effective control of Milan and was hungry to make his court the greatest in Europe. He wanted talent, he wanted genius, and above all he wanted the world to look at Milan and be impressed. Leonardo understood this, and the letter he wrote is one of the most remarkable documents of the Renaissance. He spent most of it describing himself as a military engineer. He wrote that he could build portable bridges for armies crossing rivers. He described a design for an armored vehicle that could move through enemy lines. He wrote about new types of cannons, methods for destroying fortifications, systems for draining moats. Page after page of military capability, precisely the kind of thing a ruler building power would want to hear. And then, near the very end, almost as a quiet footnote, he mentioned that he could also paint, sculpt, design buildings, and compose music. If any of that might be useful. It was strategic, well calculated, and absolutely brilliant. Ludovico hired him. In 1482, Leonardo da Vinci left Florence for Milan. He was 30 years old, and the next 17 years would be the most productive of his life. In Milan, Leonardo was given a title and a role that was essentially impossible to describe in a single word. He was listed in the Duke's official records as painter and engineer. But that did not come close to covering what he actually did. He designed elaborate theatrical productions for court festivals. He invented stage machinery, created costumes and floats, designed improvements to Milan's canal system, proposing engineering solutions to water flow and irrigation that were still being referenced centuries later. He advised on architecture and designed the crossing tower for the Milan Cathedral. He created musical instruments and composed music. It didn't end there. He was given one commission above all others, the one that Ludovico wanted to define his reign. A horse statue, not just any horse, the largest bronze equestrian statue ever attempted, a monument to Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza, the man who had built the Sforza dynasty. 70 tons of bronze had been set aside for casting. The finished statue was meant to stand 24 feet tall. Leonardo threw himself into it. He studied horses obsessively. He drew them from every angle, every position, every muscle group. He spent years on preparatory sketches. He visited the stables of the Milanese nobility and drew individual horses by name, noting their breeds and their owners. He filled entire sections of his notebooks with equestrian studies so detailed that they read like a scientific treatise on the anatomy of movement. By 1493, he had completed a full-scale clay model. 24 feet tall, it was displayed publicly at the wedding of Ludovico's niece, Bianca Maria Sforza, and was met with wonder. It surpassed in size every other equestrian monument in Italy. People came to see it as if it were already a finished masterpiece. Then history intervened. In 1494, with French forces threatening northern Italy, Ludovico made a decision. The 70 tons of bronze set aside for Leonardo's horse was needed for something more urgent. He sent it to the Duke of Ferrara to be cast into cannons. Leonardo's great horse would never be cast. When the French armies swept through Milan in 1499 and Ludovico's power collapsed, the clay model that had taken years to build became target practice for French crossbowmen. They used it as a kind of joke, shooting bolts into the neck and flanks of the great clay horse until it was destroyed. Leonardo watched one of the defining projects of his life be turned into rubble. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, because the Gran Cavallo is not just a story about a lost sculpture. It is a story about what it meant to be Leonardo. He had spent years, over a decade, on something magnificent, and in the end, forces completely outside his control simply erased it. This would happen to him again and again. It would have broken most men. But Leonardo opened a new notebook and kept drawing. 500 years later, in 1999, an American pilot and art lover named Charles Dent spent years fundraising to finish what Leonardo had started. A bronze horse, based on Leonardo's surviving drawings, was cast and installed in Milan near the Hippodrome. It stands there today, 25 feet tall, weighing 15 tons. Leonardo never got to see it. But it exists because of him. While Leonardo was painting commissions and designing festivals and building clay horses, he was also doing something that had no name yet and no clear category. He was doing science, not the university science of his era, which was mostly about reading ancient Greek and Roman texts and accepting what those texts said. Leonardo had no university education. He could not read Latin, the language that most serious scholarship of his time was written in. He freely admitted this, calling himself a man without letters, meaning a man without formal academic training. But Leonardo had something far rarer than a Latin education. He watched. He looked at the world the way other people do not look at it, not glancing, not noticing, but truly seeing. He asked why and how about things that everyone else took for granted, and then he sat with those questions until he had answers, or until a better question appeared. Beginning around 1490, he developed a serious habit of recording his studies in detailed illustrated notebooks. Over the course of his lifetime, he filled what historians estimate was over 5,000 pages that still survive today. And he may have produced at least twice as many that were lost or destroyed in the centuries after his death. He wrote in his famous mirror script, right to left, backwards, only readable when held up to a mirror. Whether this was purely because he was left-handed and it felt more natural, or whether it was a deliberate effort to protect his ideas or simply a habit he fell into, has never been definitively settled. What is clear is that the mirror writing, combined with the fact that the notebooks were never published in his lifetime, meant that most of his scientific observations stayed completely unknown to the world for centuries. What was in those notebooks? Start with flight. Leonardo studied birds with such systematic precision that he designed a human flying machine based on the mechanics of bird wings. He called it an ornithopter. It was a device with large fabric wings operated by the pilot's arms and legs, modeled on how he observed birds moving through air. He identified the aerodynamic principles involved with genuine accuracy, even if the ornithopter itself could never have lifted a human being. The bird's wing was the template. The physics he described were real. He also designed what we would recognize today as a helicopter. He called it the aerial screw. It was a device with a helical spiral blade that he theorized could drill itself upward through the air if rotated fast enough. He drew it around 1489. The principle was correct. The engineering of his era could not build one that worked. He designed a parachute, a pyramid-shaped linen canopy that he calculated could slow a man's fall from any height. In 2000, a British skydiver named Adrian Nicholas had one built to Leonardo's exact specifications and jumped with it. It worked. He designed an armored fighting vehicle, a covered wagon on wheels with a conical shell and openings for cannons at every angle, propelled by cranks operated from inside. Concept drawings for what would take the world another 4 centuries to actually build and call a tank. He designed a solar power concentrator to heat water, a robot in the shape of a knight with mechanical joints that could move, a diving suit for underwater exploration, a self-propelled cart that modern engineers have identified as the world's first programmable robot, and a bridge design for the Golden Horn in Constantinople that was so far ahead of its time that it was turned down by the Ottoman Sultan as impractical, only to be proven structurally sound when a Norwegian engineer finally analyzed it in the 20th century. All of this in notebooks that no one was reading. And then there is the anatomy. Leonardo began dissecting human bodies, working quietly in hospitals and medical facilities in Florence, Milan, and later Rome. He did this at a time when the Catholic Church viewed the opening of human corpses with deep suspicion. He had to work carefully, discreetly. But he worked. Over the course of his lifetime, he dissected and studied an estimated 30 or more human bodies. He produced over 200 detailed drawings of what he found, drawings of a precision and accuracy that no one had ever achieved before. He was the first to draw the human spine in correct curvature. He produced accurate illustrations of the human heart, identifying the 4 chambers and beginning to understand the mechanics of how blood moved through the body, coming remarkably close to the theory of blood circulation that William Harvey would formally describe more than 100 years later. He drew the fetus in the womb with a precision that stunned modern physicians when the drawings were finally studied carefully. He illustrated the layers of muscle beneath the skin, the structure of tendons, the mechanics of joints. His drawing of a baby positioned in the womb, made around 1511, was not equaled in medical illustration for nearly a century. And none of it was published. None of it reached the doctors and surgeons who might have used it to save lives, because the notebook sat in private hands, unseen. He also drew the Vitruvian Man. Around 1490, Leonardo created what would become one of the most reproduced images in the world. A drawing of a man, arms and legs extended in 2 positions simultaneously, inscribed inside both a circle and a square. It was based on the writings of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, who had proposed that the human body embodied perfect geometric proportions. Leonardo took that idea and tested it. He measured, he calculated, he drew the results with the care of a man who believed that the beauty of the human form and the laws of mathematics were expressions of the same underlying truth. The Vitruvian Man is not just a drawing. It is a statement about how Leonardo saw the world, science and art inseparable, the body and the cosmos speaking the same language. In 1496, a Franciscan friar and mathematician named Luca Pacioli arrived at the court of Ludovico Sforza in Milan. Pacioli was extraordinary in his own right. He is known today as the father of accounting, the man who first codified and published the double-entry bookkeeping system that forms the basis of modern accounting. He was also one of the leading mathematical minds of his era. When he and Leonardo met, it was one of those rare collisions between two great minds where each one recognizes something essential in the other. Under Pacioli's guidance, Leonardo studied Euclidean geometry formally for the first time. Pacioli was reportedly astonished by how quickly Leonardo grasped mathematical concepts that most students labored over for years, and by the artist's extraordinary ability to visualize and illustrate abstract geometric forms. The two men collaborated on a book. Pacioli wrote the text. Leonardo provided the illustrations. The book was called De Divina Proporzione, meaning on the divine proportion. It was about the mathematics of the golden ratio, the proportion approximately equal to 1.618, which appears with astonishing frequency in nature, in geometry, in architecture, and in the human body. Pacioli called it divine because he believed it revealed the hand of God in the structure of creation. Leonardo drew 59 full-page illustrations of three-dimensional geometric solids for the book, drawn with a precision and clarity that had never been achieved before in printed illustration. Skeletal forms, solid forms, truncated forms, each one a small work of art. De Divina Proporzione was published in Venice in 1509. It was among the very first books to be illustrated by a Leonardo drawing that appeared in print during his lifetime. The friendship between Leonardo and Pacioli lasted for years after the book was finished. When Ludovico Sforza's power collapsed in 1499 and Leonardo was forced to flee Milan, Pacioli went with him. They left together and traveled to Venice, and then to Florence. And through all of it, the notebooks kept filling up. Before we leave Milan, we have to stop, because between 1495 and 1498, in the dining hall of the Church of Santa Maria delle Grazie, Leonardo created something that millions of people every year still travel to Italy specifically to see. The commission came from Ludovico Sforza. The subject was the Last Supper, the final meal of Jesus Christ with his 12 disciples. The night before his arrest and crucifixion, it was one of the most painted subjects in all of Christian art. Dozens of artists had done it before Leonardo. They would do it after him too. None of them did what he did. Most painters showed the disciples seated calmly around the table, serene, almost decorative. Halos and reverence, a scene of holy stillness. Leonardo asked himself a different question. What would that room have looked like the exact moment Jesus said, "One of you will betray me"? He captured the instant of shock. 13 men, 13 completely different reactions. Some lean forward, some pull back, some argue. Thomas raises a pointed finger. Philip stands and presses his hands to his chest. Peter grips a knife. James throws his arms wide in disbelief, and Judas, the betrayer, recoils slightly, his hand clutching a small bag of coins, the payment he had already received. Leonardo did not need to label him. The gesture says everything. Every figure is psychologically distinct. Every gesture tells a different emotional story. And Jesus sits at the center of it all, calm, open-handed, still. The compositional architecture is extraordinary. Every line in the room, the perspective lines of the ceiling, the windows, the walls, converges on the face of Christ. Your eye is pulled there no matter where it enters the painting. Leonardo spent 3 years working on it. He would walk across Milan to find a face in the streets or the prisons that matched what he needed for a particular disciple. He would stand before the wall for hours, doing nothing, just thinking, running the composition through his mind. The prior of the monastery complained to Ludovico about the pace of progress. According to Vasari, Leonardo appeared before the Duke and said that 2 figures in the painting were giving him particular difficulty. One was Judas, and he had not yet found the right face for such a man. He told Ludovico that if he could not find a suitable model for Judas elsewhere, He might be forced to use the prior's face. The prior apparently stopped complaining. Leonardo finished it around 1498. He used a technique that was not traditional fresco, where paint is applied to wet plaster and bonds permanently as the plaster dries. Instead, he used a mix of tempera and oil on dried plaster, giving him more control and the ability to rework sections the way he would a panel painting. But this choice had a terrible consequence. The painting began deteriorating almost immediately after he finished it. By the 16th century, visitors were already noting how damaged it looked. Today, after centuries of deterioration, damage, botched restoration attempts, a door that was cut through the lower part of the wall by monks who did not know what they were destroying, and the bombing that collapsed the building's roof during World War II, relatively little of Leonardo's original paint layer survives. What survives is the idea, the composition, the light, the drama. And it is enough. People still stand in that room and go quiet. In October of 1499, the French king Louis XII sent his armies into Milan. Ludovico Sforza, who had been Leonardo's patron for 17 years, lost his grip on the city and was forced to flee. He was eventually captured by the French and died in a prison in Loches, France, in 1508, far from the court he had built. Leonardo had served Ludovico through the most productive years of his life. He had produced the Last Supper and had nearly completed the Gran Cavallo. He had filled notebooks that would eventually be recognized as among the most remarkable documents in human history. And now it was over. He packed what he could, his notebooks, his paintings, his instruments. He left Milan with his assistant Salaì and his friend Luca Pacioli. They traveled to Venice first, where Leonardo was hired to advise on military defenses against a potential Ottoman naval attack. He proposed flooding the Isonzo River valley to create a barrier. The plan was not used. Then he returned to Florence. Florence in 1500 was a changed city. The Medici had been driven out 6 years earlier during a period of political upheaval. The friar Girolamo Savonarola had swept through, preaching fire and brimstone, burning books and paintings and mirrors in what he called the bonfire of the vanities. Savonarola himself had been burned at the stake in 1498, but the mood of the city still carried the memory of that instability. Leonardo and his household were given space at the monastery of Santissima Annunziata. He set up a workshop there and began drawing again. He produced a cartoon, which in Renaissance terms meant a large preparatory drawing, of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and Saint John the Baptist. It was drawn in charcoal and chalk, and it was not a finished painting. It was a working study. But when it was displayed, something extraordinary happened. According to Vasari, men and women, young and old, flocked to see it as if they were attending a great festival. They queued, they pressed to get a closer look at this drawing, this preparation for a painting that did not yet exist. Florence recognized genius when it stood in front of it. In the summer of 1502, Leonardo made one of the most unusual decisions of his life. He entered the service of Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was, depending on your perspective, either one of the most brilliant military and political minds of the Renaissance or one of its most ruthless and feared monsters. He was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI and had been given command of the papal armies, which he used with extraordinary effectiveness and extraordinary brutality to seize control of large parts of central Italy. He was 27 years old and was widely believed to have murdered his own brother. He was said to have had his brother-in-law strangled. He inspired Niccolò Machiavelli, who would travel with him during this same period, to write The Prince, the foundational text of political realism and the original blueprint for the idea that a ruler must be willing to do whatever is necessary to hold power. Leonardo, at 50 years of age, accepted the title of senior military architect and general engineer, and traveled with Borgia's forces across central Italy for almost a year. Why? Perhaps because Borgia was at the absolute peak of his power and genuinely compelling to be near. Perhaps because the work itself was fascinating. Perhaps because Leonardo needed employment and stability after the collapse of his Milan years. Whatever the reason, what he produced during that year was remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with warfare. Leonardo created maps, but not the kind of maps that existed in 1502. Those maps were rough, schematic, drawn from ground level with limited geometric accuracy. What Leonardo produced for Cesare Borgia were bird's-eye view maps drawn with the precision of a modern aerial survey. The most famous of these is his map of the city of Imola, drawn in 1502. It is a perfect overhead view of the city. The streets, the buildings, the walls, the river, all rendered with extraordinary geometric accuracy. He measured and paced distances. He used a compass and his understanding of geometry to construct a view of the city as seen from directly above, a perspective that no one in 1502 had ever actually occupied. Modern historians consider Leonardo's Imola map a foundational document in the history of cartography. It anticipates the techniques of aerial mapping by more than 400 years. He was not inventing, perhaps just observing as always. During this same period, Leonardo reportedly met Niccolò Machiavelli, who was in Borgia's orbit as a Florentine diplomat. It has been suggested that Leonardo's habit of applying systematic observation to problems, testing ideas against reality rather than theory, had some influence on the man who would become the father of modern political science. Whether that is precisely true, the coincidence of the two greatest analytical minds of their generation in the same physical space at the same moment is something worth sitting with for a moment. Around 1503, back in Florence, Leonardo began a portrait. The commission came from a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. He wanted a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini, to commemorate the birth of their second child and the completion of their new home. It was a reasonable, routine commission for a successful artist, a portrait of a merchant's wife. Leonardo never delivered it. He kept working on it. For years, carrying it with him when he returned to Milan, carrying it to Rome, carrying it eventually to France. Still working, still not satisfied. He added layers so thin, so transparent, that no brushstrokes were visible. The painting that became known as the Mona Lisa, from the Italian Madonna Lisa, meaning My Lady Lisa, accumulated somewhere between 15 and 30 layers of glazing over the years. Some of those layers are estimated by modern scientists, using infrared technology, to be as thin as 2 micrometers. That is 0.002 of a millimeter. He was painting with the tip of a feather, almost. The Mona Lisa today hangs in the Louvre Museum in Paris. It is the most visited painting on Earth. Millions of people every year press into that gallery to stand before it. And every year, a significant number of them are surprised by how small it is. 77 centimeters tall, 53 centimeters wide, smaller than most people's television sets. But it does something that almost no other painting does. She looks at you, not at a fixed point behind you, not past you, at you. Wherever you stand in the room, her gaze follows. Her smile shifts depending on where you focus, which part of her face you look at first. Is she pleased? Is she sad? Is she on the edge of saying something? The technique Leonardo used is called sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke. It means painting without hard edges, blending light into shadow so gradually and so softly that the transitions are invisible. The human eye does not see hard outlines in the real world. Real light does not cut cleanly. Leonardo knew this, and he painted the way the eye actually works, rather than the way the hand wants to draw. He invented sfumato, or at least he perfected it to a degree no one before him had reached. And it is what makes her feel like a person rather than a painting. When scientists at the Louvre used X-ray fluorescence and infrared reflectography to examine the painting in the 21st century, they found exactly what the layers of sfumato looked like from underneath. They found the underdrawing. They found pentimenti, the Italian word for changes of mind. Places where Leonardo had adjusted the composition, widened the pose, reconsidered the light. They found a man who was never finished, who was always asking whether it could be more true. He was in his 50s when he began it. He was still carrying it when he died at 67. Some historians call the Mona Lisa the greatest painting in the history of Western art. Leonardo himself apparently never thought it was done. In 1503, the government of Florence gave Leonardo a commission to paint a mural in the Great Council chamber of the Palazzo Vecchio. The subject was the Battle of Anghiari, a famous Florentine military victory over Milan in 1440. At the same time, they gave another commission to another painter for the wall directly opposite Leonardo's. The painter was Michelangelo. If you wanted to manufacture the most electrically charged artistic rivalry in history, you could not have designed it better. The two greatest painters of the Italian Renaissance, both working in the same room at the same time, competing for the same wall space in Florence's most important civic building. And they hated each other. The animosity went back years. In Florence before 1500, Michelangelo had made a cutting public remark about Leonardo's unfinished equestrian monument in Milan, implying that Leonardo had been unable to cast it. Leonardo never forgave him. The two men's approaches to art were in almost complete opposition. Michelangelo worked at explosive, furious speed, pouring himself into physical labor, carving marble until his hands bled. Leonardo planned endlessly, theorized, observed, and revised. To Michelangelo, this looked like hesitation. To Leonardo, Michelangelo's approach looked like brute force masquerading as genius. Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari would have been his largest work. The planned mural was intended to be roughly 54 feet wide. He chose to depict the central scene of the battle, 4 soldiers on horseback, locked in a struggle over a military standard, the flag that represented the honor of their forces. He called this section the Fight for the Standard. The preparatory drawings that survive show something extraordinary. Horses rearing and biting, men screaming, bodies contorted in violence and terror and exertion. It was war without glory, conflict without dignity, the raw, ugly physics of men killing each other. Leonardo completed at least part of the central section, and copies made by other artists in the following decades, the most famous by the Flemish master Peter Paul Rubens, show what was there. Even in copies, the energy of the original is palpable. Then, in the spring of 1506, Leonardo stopped. He received a request from the French authorities, who now controlled Milan, asking him to return to the city. The Florentine government, navigating the complex politics of dealing with French power, gave him permission. Leonardo left Florence and never returned to finish the Battle of Anghiari. By 1563, the section he had completed was covered over or destroyed when the room was renovated by another artist. Some researchers in recent years have proposed the intriguing theory that the mural was not destroyed, but simply plastered over and might still exist beneath the current wall surface. Ground-penetrating scans have found hints of an air gap behind the plaster that could be consistent with a hidden layer beneath. Whether Leonardo's lost masterpiece is sleeping behind a Florentine wall is one of art history's great open questions. Through all of this, Leonardo moved through the world with a distinctive kind of aloneness around him. Not isolation exactly. He was never without company. He had assistants, pupils, patrons, and colleagues throughout his life. He was widely admired and personally magnetic, but there was an interior life that he kept entirely to himself. In 1490, a boy arrived in Leonardo's household in Milan. His name was Gian Giacomo Caprotti da Oreno. He was 10 years old. He came as a household servant, specifically as an errand boy who would work in exchange for lodging. Within a year, Leonardo had given him a nickname that tells you everything about their dynamic. He called him Salaì. It means roughly, little devil. In his notebooks, Leonardo made a list of the boy's behavior after barely 12 months in his house. He had stolen money and valuables. He had stolen from other members of the household. He had spent an excessive amount on clothing. A thief, a liar, stubborn and a glutton. Leonardo wrote it all down, and then kept him anyway. Salaì stayed in Leonardo's household for nearly 30 years. He traveled with him from Milan to Venice, to Florence, to Rome, to France. He appears in Leonardo's accounts. He eventually became a painter himself, though never at the level of his master. He painted a nude version of the Mona Lisa, known as the Monna Vanna, which some scholars believe Leonardo himself may have partly worked on. When Leonardo died, he left Salaì half of his vineyard outside Milan. What Salaì was to Leonardo emotionally and personally, no one can say with absolute certainty. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. What is clear is that Leonardo kept this troublesome, charming, irresponsible young man close to him for 3 decades, which is not something you do for a servant you feel nothing particular for. The other great companion of Leonardo's later years was entirely different. Francesco Melzi was the son of a Milanese nobleman. He was young, educated, well-mannered, and deeply devoted to Leonardo. He joined the household around 1506, when Leonardo returned to Milan from Florence. He was perhaps 15 or 16 years old. If Salaì was the difficult beloved, Melzi was the loyal heir. He stayed with Leonardo through the rest of his life, traveled with him to France, sat with him at Clos-Luz in his final years. When Leonardo died, Melzi wrote to Leonardo's half-brothers to inform them of the death. The letter he wrote speaks of Leonardo as a father figure, a dearest parent, a man toward whom he felt both love and profound grief. Leonardo left Melzi all of his paintings, his tools, his books, and critically, his notebooks. Everything. It was Melzi who packed up the thousands of pages of manuscript, who organized and catalogued them, who carried them back to Italy and spent the rest of his life, until his own death in 1570, trying to bring some order to the vast accumulation of Leonardo's thinking. He never finished. The project was too large, but he preserved them. If it were not for Francesco Melzi, those notebooks might have been lost entirely. Leonardo's science, his anatomy, his engineering, all of it would have been scattered and forgotten. We owe one of the great intellectual inheritances of human history to a devoted young man who simply refused to let go. From 1513 to 1516, Leonardo lived in Rome. He was in his 60s. His patrons had shifted to Giuliano de' Medici, the younger brother of Pope Leo X. He was given rooms in the Belvedere section of the Vatican and a workshop. He was surrounded by the greatest concentration of artistic talent in the world. Raphael was working in the Vatican on the frescoes that would define his legacy. Michelangelo had finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling just the year before. Rome in 1513 was buzzing with ambition and competition and money. Leonardo somehow seemed separate from all of it. He continued his studies. He worked on anatomy. He designed theatrical productions for Giuliano. He theorized about geology and water. He worked on the paintings he still carried with him, but the Pope forbade him from dissecting human cadavers at the hospitals of Rome. This was a serious blow. His anatomical work, which had been so rich and systematic in Milan and Florence, was suddenly cut off. His response to this constraint tells you something about who he was. He wrote in his notebooks that the Pope had blocked him, and then he simply went on to other questions. Blocked in one direction, moving in another. Michelangelo and Raphael had the commissions. They had the walls. They had the glory. Leonardo was in the same building, working quietly on problems that nobody else had even thought to ask. When Giuliano de' Medici died in March of 1516, Leonardo lost his last Italian patron. He was 64 years old. He did not go back to Florence. He did not try to attach himself to another Italian court. A letter arrived from France. King Francis I of France was 22 years old when he sent for Leonardo. He was young, brilliant, extravagant, and hungry for everything the Italian Renaissance had to offer. He had already moved to reclaim Milan, which he did in 1515, and at a meeting in Bologna in December of that year, Leonardo was present at a summit between Francis and Pope Leo X. Something passed between the French king and the Italian painter at that meeting. Some recognition, some quality in each other that each found compelling. Francis offered Leonardo the title of premier painter, engineer, and architect of the king. He gave him a manor house called Clos Luce, a beautiful stone residence just a few hundred meters from the royal chateau at Amboise, connected to the palace by an underground tunnel so the king could visit privately without ceremony. And the king asked almost nothing in return. He wanted Leonardo's company, his conversation, his thinking. He wanted to be near the greatest mind of his generation. Leonardo arrived at Clos Luce in 1516, at 64 years old. He brought 3 paintings with him. The Mona Lisa, St. John the Baptist, a haunting and tender image of the prophet with a curiously gentle, androgynous face that has fascinated and unsettled viewers for 5 centuries. And the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, a painting he had been working on and off, for years. He also brought his notebooks. His right hand was no longer reliable. He had suffered what appears to have been a partial stroke some time before his arrival in France, which had left the hand he used for painting weakened. He could still draw with his left hand, still think with extraordinary clarity, and could still fill pages with ideas. But the time for great public commissions was past. What the years at Clos Luce gave Leonardo was something rare and precious, and perhaps for a man who had spent his entire life in the service of patrons with specific demands, genuinely new. Peace. He organized his notebooks, trying to arrange decades of observations into something more coherent. A great treatise on painting, on water, on anatomy, on mechanics. He never finished it. The material was too vast, the time too short. He received visitors. He walked the grounds, and also designed a mechanical lion for the king, a device that could walk across a room on its own and then open its chest to reveal a cluster of lilies, the symbol of the French monarchy. Engineering and spectacle married one final time. Antonio de Beatis, a secretary who visited Clos Luce in October of 1517 and left one of the few direct first-hand accounts of Leonardo in his final years, described him as an old man of more than 70, though Leonardo was actually 65 at the time, which perhaps tells us something about how age had worn on him. De Beatis described a man who could no longer paint with total freedom due to paralysis in his right hand, but who was still full of ideas and still capable of remarkable drawing with his left. King Francis reportedly said of Leonardo, "There has never been another man born in the world who knew as much as Leonardo, not so much about painting, sculpture, and architecture, as that he was a very great philosopher." This was not patronizing praise. This was a young king trying to find words for something he had not encountered before and could not quite categorize. On the 23rd of April, 1519, Leonardo made his will. He left his notebooks and paintings to Melzi. He left Salaì half of his vineyard outside Milan. He left money to each of his servants. He made provisions for masses to be said in his name at 3 churches in Amboise. 9 days later, on the 2nd of May, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died. He was 67 years old. The circumstances of his death have been romanticized since almost the moment they happened. One account, popularized in later centuries, describes King Francis at Leonardo's bedside, holding him as he died, the greatest king in Europe in the arms of the greatest genius of his age. The historian and biographer Giorgio Vasari recorded this image, and it became iconic. Modern historians are cautious about taking it at face value. Court records suggest Francis may have been elsewhere in France that day. But the story persists because it feels true, because it captures something real about the relationship between these two men, and about what Leonardo meant to the world, even in the last years of his life. He was buried in the church of Saint-Florentin at Amboise. The church was largely destroyed during the French Revolution. In 1863, remains believed to be Leonardo's were collected from the site and reinterred in the chapel of Saint-Hubert on the grounds of Château d'Amboise. A stone marker stands there today. After Leonardo died, Francesco Melzi carried the notebooks back to Italy. He catalogued them as best he could. When Melzi died in 1570, the notebooks passed to his family, who did not fully understand what they had. Some pages were sold off to collectors, some were lost, some found their way into royal libraries in Spain, in France, in Britain. Over the following centuries, the notebooks drifted further apart. The Codex Atlanticus went to the Ambrosiana Library in Milan. The Windsor sheets went to the British Royal Collection. The Codex Leicester, the notebook in which Leonardo recorded his observations on water, geology, and the movement of rivers, passed from collection to collection until it was purchased at auction in 1994 for $30 million. The buyer was Bill Gates. It was only in the 19th century, when scholars began to study the notebooks seriously and systematically, that the full scope of what was inside them became clear. And what they found there made people stop. He had described the principles governing how fluids move in ways that would form the foundation of the science of hydrodynamics, which would not be formally developed until the 17th and 18th centuries. He had observed the fossil shells embedded in the mountains of northern Italy and understood correctly that these mountains had once been submerged beneath the sea. He had described the layering of geological strata in terms that anticipate the science of geology by centuries. He had come remarkably close to understanding blood circulation, a theory that William Harvey would formally and completely describe in 1628, more than 100 years after Leonardo's death. His designs for flying machines, tanks, solar concentrators, robots, and submarines were not the fantasies of a dreamer. They were the engineering proposals of a man who understood the physical principles involved, even if the manufacturing technology of his era could not build what he imagined. He was not always right. He made errors. He held some incorrect beliefs about how the body worked, inheriting mistakes from ancient sources he could not fully escape. He was human. He had limits. But the questions he asked and the method he used to ask them, looking first, theorizing second, testing against observation always, were the right ones. They were the scientific method, before anyone had written it down as a method. Today, 17 completed paintings are widely attributed to Leonardo. That is all. 17 across a career of roughly 4 decades of active work. It is an astonishingly small number for an artist who is considered among the greatest who ever lived. Every one of the 17 is a masterwork. His notebooks contain an estimated 6,000 surviving pages. They cover anatomy, geology, hydrodynamics, optics, acoustics, mechanics, architecture, cartography, botany, paleontology, music, mathematics, and painting. They are the most extraordinary private intellectual record left behind by any single human being in the history of the written word. He was born the illegitimate son of a peasant woman and a notary in a small Tuscan hill town. Denied the formal education that the rules of his society said he required, and told by those same rules that he was destined for ordinary life. He looked at the world instead of those rules. He watched water, drew birds, opened human bodies, and traced the paths of veins with his pen. He built clay horses the size of buildings, and painted a woman's smile that 5 centuries of humanity have been unable to look away from. He was never satisfied, never done. His notebooks are full of half-finished thoughts, ideas that branch into other ideas, observations that leap sideways into different questions before the first ones are answered. This frustrated his patrons his entire life. It is also precisely why he saw things no one else could see, because he never decided he was finished looking. He wrote once in a notebook that no one would read for generations, "Learning never exhausts the mind." He was not writing that as advice to students. He was writing it as a confession, as a description of his own life. The thing that had kept him going since the day a boy in Vinci started drawing birds in the grass and could not understand why anyone would want to stop. And 500 years later, we are still reading his notes. We are still in many ways catching up.